Hey everybody, welcome to LeCarner's Apocalypse 2020 edition. Uh, so this is a very strange time we find ourselves in, obviously. But hopefully we can support each other and do our part, and we will get back to some semblance of normal sometime soon, hopefully. I know there are a lot of question marks in your life right now, and I just want to begin this little intro by just saying how bummed I am for the senior class that you guys are all going through this. As you know, my son is a senior as well, so he's going through the same uncertainties that you guys are. And for those of you who are athletes, your seasons are either postponed or completely canceled. And I know how important that is to you all. And it sucks, and my heart goes out to you, and I'm really bummed that this has happened to you guys. Lots of uncertainties about capstone, about prom, graduation. I don't have any answers yet. I'm hopeful that in the coming week or two, we might get some guidance and some direction on those events. Until then, just wing it, and hopefully we can get through this together. And hopefully the admin will give us some direction as well, because we're all looking for answers right now, and nobody really has any. So. For now, I guess we just do what we can to get through the end of the semester, and I'd like to do that with one of the greatest novels I've ever read, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. This little gem. I think I hope, it is my hope that while you will struggle with this book, it will be a struggle that is worthwhile. It is one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, and quite possibly one of the greatest novels ever written. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about James Joyce as a writer, and his importance to the field. And then I'm going to transition into a PowerPoint presentation about the novel itself, about the genres, multiple genres that this novel inhabits, and a little bit about the structure of the novel. And hopefully this sort of intro will make it a little bit easier for you to understand. Once you get into it, it's kind of like reading Shakespeare. Once you get into it and you start practicing and getting more comfortable with the language, it becomes much easier to read. And it is true for Joyce as well. The novel is very strange in the beginning, and it changes dramatically over the course of the narrative. So my hope is that this introduction and the PowerPoint that follows will give you a little bit of clarity in an otherwise kind of a messy story. But it's messy because it's about life, and it's about a young man growing up. And it's just life, and life is messy. And so in that sense, it's quite accurate. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to tell you a little story about Greek mythology that hopefully will also shed some light on this story, because our main character in the novel is named Stephen Daedalus. And Stephen's surname might ring some bells for some of you who are read in Greek mythology. So yeah, hopefully this all will shed some light on the novel as we get into it. The next step after the PowerPoint will be a live lecture, which you'll get a notice for in your email. And I'll post on Google Classroom as well. But it'll be about the first few pages of the novel, and we'll talk about that together, and we'll have a chat, and I'll explain how the rest of the semester is going to go, or at least the next few weeks. So I hope you're all doing well, and without further ado, let's get into a PowerPoint. So we'll see you in a minute. Okay, before I get into the PowerPoint presentation properly, I want to talk a little bit about Joyce as a writer. It's hard to overestimate how important Joyce is to literature and the literary world. He's certainly one of the most influential modernists, but probably one of the most influential writers of all time. His influence on the fictional technique of 20th century writers, from traditional realist authors to experimental postmodernists, is impossible to quantify. He has impacted everyone, and most of the major writers of the 20th and 21st century acknowledge the debt that they owe to James Joyce. Now, James Joyce is primarily known, his most famous novel is called Ulysses. It's famous for a lot of reasons. One, it's incredibly experimental, and it's really bizarre, and it's really, really good. It's probably best left for a college lit class, which is why I don't teach it. But it was also involved in a major lawsuit that went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court in 1933, the United States versus one book entitled Ulysses. That was the name of the case. And it was an obscenity case, and it was one of the landmark cases in Supreme Court history. It defined for generations what something that was obscene looked like. And the Supreme Court ultimately determined that this novel was not considered obscene, although it was confiscated by U.S. Customs and banned because of language and sexual descriptions and things like that. But Ulysses is for another day. Certainly, the portrait that we're about to read is his most widely read novel. It's certainly the most frequently taught James Joyce work, with the exception of maybe Dubliners, which is a series, a collection of short stories. But I think Portrait is probably the most widely read James Joyce work, certainly in university classrooms. But what's interesting about Portrait and its commonality is that a lot of students find this novel outside of a classroom. And so a lot of young people, particularly, sort of advanced AP high school students or college students, come to this novel through recommendations of professors or teachers or whomever. And despite the surface difficulties of the novel, young people invariably respond to this story. They react to it. They feel this story because it's eerily convincing. It is a story about a young person, a very sensitive young person who is trying to deal with growing up, maturity, puberty, sexuality, religion, life direction, family, dad issues. It's a hot mess. But guess what? Life is a hot mess, right? And so that's why so many young people resonate with this book. And once you get past, like I said, the surface difficulties, we'll deal with those. Once you get into the story proper, you'll see why this book is so revered. It was a literary critic named Richard Ellman And he wrote in a biography of James Joyce that his method, James Joyce's method of composition, was something called the imaginative absorption of stray material. The imaginative absorption of stray material. And what he was describing there is something called stream of consciousness, which I'm going to talk about briefly in the PowerPoint coming up. But I think it's important to recognize that this novel is really one of the first. It's certainly not the first, but it's one of the most perfected. James Joyce goes on later to really, really perfect this in Ulysses, as does Virginia Woolf in Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, and several other authors during the modernist period. But this idea of stream of consciousness was in its budding form at this time, and James Joyce really sort of nails it in this novel. So a little bit of background about Joyce. There's a slide in the PowerPoint presentation coming up that gives you a little bit of information about his life. It's a bullet point list. You can just breeze through it. But it's important to note that this novel is semi-autobiographical. Stephen is the main character. He's Joyce in large measure. This is a story about his life. Like Stephen, Joyce was the son of a very religious mother and a financially inept father who liked to drink. Like Stephen, Joyce was the eldest son of 10 children. He received his education in Jesuit schools. Jesuit schools are Catholic schools like Georgetown or Gonzaga. Like Stephen, Joyce left Ireland to pursue his life as a poet and a writer. And he began working on stories that formed the foundation of the novel, I think as early as 1902 or 1903. The novel was originally published in a magazine, not unlike Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray, called The Egoist in 1914 to 1915. It came out over the course of several months. He had originally titled it Stephen Hero, but for lots of reasons, and you'll see why when I give you a little background on the mythology behind Stephen Daedalus's name, and Stephen Hero, if we're being honest, is a little bit cheesy. And I think he realized that. So he ended up changing that before he published it. So let's look at this PowerPoint now. I'm going to go through and talk about a few slides, and this will be in a separate, it'll come next in this series of videos, but you'll just hear my voice over the slides, and feel free to email me with questions, of course, and then we'll have a live discussion in the next day or so. As I said, you'll get plenty of advance notice for that, and we'll talk more about this incredible novel. So until then, we'll see you.